Good afternoon. My name is Treshani Perera. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Music and Fine Arts Cataloging Librarian at the University of Kentucky Libraries. I also serve as the head of the Fine Arts Cataloging Unit, where I oversee operations in cataloging, processing, binding, and preservation, and manage several special projects. I'm the founding convener of the UK Libraries Subject Headings Interest Group, and I hope to talk about that group and my role later in the presentation. I want to thank the eBUG board and my colleague Daniel Nass for the invitation to present this year's keynote. This presentation has a CC BY NC license, which allows you to reuse or adapt content from slides for non-commercial purposes, as long as attribution is given to me, the creator. I will share my slides via the conference website after this keynote. This year's conference theme is inclusivity and accessibility. And I have titled this keynote as Transforming the Catalog for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility. My goal today is to present some options for prioritizing DEIA in library catalogs. I'll talk about a project I co-led and an initiative that I'm currently leading to address problematic language in an Alma Primo catalog. The expected outcome is that you will come to understand how local workflows and advocacy groups can improve DEIA in libraries. I want to start by saying that I'm primarily a traditional cataloger working with the Mark 21 format. I am not an expert when it comes to customizing an ILS system to do DEIA work. I've relied on a team of colleagues to get my vision across in many instances. What I hope to offer are some ideas for you to consider as intentional and practical steps for prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in Alma Primo catalogs. A little bit about myself and my positionality as the keynote speaker. My approach to cataloging and description in general is influenced by my lived experiences as a woman of color in the United States and in academic libraries. According to the American Library Association Diversity Counts report, the latest, which was published in 2010, academic librarianship is 86% white. I am well aware of my minoritized racial identity in professional spaces, but it also gives me a unique perspective when cataloging library collections representing historically underrepresented and marginalized people. Having said that, I cannot speak for all marginalized identities. When working with collections that highlight groups and communities outside of how I identify, I approach my work with cultural humility by reading and listening to voices from those communities. As the Music and Fine Arts Cataloging Librarian, I work with collections that have an inherent Western cultural bias because of how cultural milestones and historically significant events are defined in fine and performing arts disciplines. Just to be clear, this is not unique to my institution. Many higher ed curricula in fine and performing arts continue to embody European traditions and cultures. So library collections supporting those academic programs inherently carry that same Western cultural bias, more specifically European history and culture. Because of this inherent bias in collections, cataloging rules, guidelines, practice, and terminology tend to perpetuate those biases. I prioritize inclusive description for non-Western and non-dominant cultural resources because there are still gaps in making professional practice more inclusive. As a cataloger, I focus on keyword access in addition to access points such as subject headings for search and retrieval. For resources highlighting diversity and inclusion, I make a conscious effort to highlight gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and geographical data in resource description. One of my research areas is critical cataloging, which critiques knowledge organization systems and advocates for dismantling oppressive structures and hierarchies in cataloging and classification. As a cataloger, I believe in the power of local workflows and local headings, prioritizing inclusive language. In the next few slides, I will discuss a project I co-led and an initiative I currently lead to make our library catalog more inclusive to our local user community. I want to take a few minutes to express my gratitude to my colleagues at UK Libraries for taking small but mighty steps to support this work. What I will share in the next few slides would not have been possible if not for a collective effort. I want to recognize my colleagues in the UK Library Subject Headings Interest Group that have come together over the past year with a shared vision to transform our library catalog by removing or hiding problematic subject headings from display, adding local headings with inclusive language, and by educating each other about initiatives, resources, and platforms we can use to prioritize DEIA work. To begin, our first successful attempt to transform the catalog and advocate for inclusive language was back in 2019. My colleague Catherine Leibarger and I co-led a project to remove the offensive Library of Congress subject heading illegal aliens from our library catalog. I also want to give a shout out to Daniel Nass, who assisted with system changes. Before I get to our workflow, I want to set the stage with some background information. In 2014, undocumented students at Dartmouth College worked with their librarians to propose a new subject heading, undocumented immigrants. The new heading was rejected by the Library of Congress. This led to increased advocacy in the library community. An ALA working group made a strong recommendation that LCSH illegal aliens be changed to undocumented immigrants, and that heading change proposal was submitted in 2016, along with the new heading that was previously rejected. In March 2016, Library of Congress tentatively approved the heading change, but recommended that two headings, non-citizens and unauthorized immigration, replace the LCSH illegal aliens. There was a press release explaining LC's process, which you can find in the 2016 report linked here. But before the heading change was finalized, the United States Congress intervened and urged LC to retain aliens and illegal aliens, as well as other related Library of Congress subject headings. A bill impacting LC's budget was introduced in Congress, at which point LC pulled the plug on changes with no further discussion. So the 2016 report that is linked here provides a good background and contextual information around these issues. In November 2021, ALA announced that the Library of Congress is changing LCSH illegal aliens to two headings, non-citizens and illegal immigration. So back in 2016, LC's recommendation was to use non-citizens and unauthorized immigration. But what they ended up approving last November was non-citizens and illegal immigration. There has been no public statement from LC as to why they went with illegal immigration and not unauthorized immigration, which was their recommendation back in 2016. As far as changes are considered, illegal aliens is no longer an authorized subject heading. But the word illegal continues to appear in library catalogs. So yes, there was some progress after 5 years, but the change is not ideal. Between 2016 and the heading finally changing in 2021, several libraries adopted a local heading in place of LCSH illegal aliens. UK Libraries was one of those institutions that made a local change. The other report I've linked here is from another ALA working group in 2019 that surveyed libraries that had adopted local headings in place of LCSH illegal aliens. That group put together a report outlining survey findings and was published in 2020. And that report is also linked here. In this slide, I will briefly talk about the work I co-led at UK Libraries. In fall of 2019, my colleague Catherine and I proposed a project to replace LCSH illegal aliens with the local heading undocumented immigrants. So as a quick aside, I was a member of our Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee that year and worked independently with another colleague in the committee and 2 LIS faculty at UK to organize a screening of the documentary Change the Subject. If you haven't seen the documentary, I highly recommend it. It is now freely available through the Dartmouth College Library's digital collections platform, and I've included a link here. The documentary came out in June 2019. The Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee and the UK School of Library and Information Science co-sponsored a screening in September 2019. And we held a focused discussion on how we could take concrete action to address this problematic heading. So around the same time, Catherine and I finished our proposal and presented to departmental leadership. We went through a vetting process involving our collections and technical services colleagues and presented our proposal to everyone in the library during a library-wide meeting in December 2019. We clearly outlined our process to automate the subject heading change in ALMA and gave our colleagues an opportunity to ask questions about our workflow. With overwhelming support from our colleagues and library leadership, we implemented the heading change using a normalization rule. On the right is the ALMA normalization rule Catherine created for our workflow. This rule was applied to all records in our institutional zone as a one-time batch heading change. The rule was set up to automatically trigger the heading change when future records are saved in the institutional zone. This normalization rule was in use up until the LCSH change last year. So in other words, this rule is not triggered anymore since illegal aliens is now an obsolete subject heading. The second example I want to talk about is an initiative I started in July 2021. During the racial justice movement following George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020, UK Libraries also issued a statement renewing the organization's commitment to equity and identified cataloging as an area for DEI work. A year later, in June 2021, I pitched the idea of a local advocacy group focusing on problematic subject headings. This was to be an informal group and an intellectual and virtual space for everyone in the library, and not just for catalogers, to come together to discuss problematic headings and identify local workarounds, similar to what we had done back in 2019, but at a small group level. This would also give my colleagues and I an opportunity to make immediate impact at local level instead of waiting for subject headings to be revised by the Library of Congress. In the next couple of slides, I'll talk about our work so far and my experience as the founding convener of the UK Libraries Subject Headings Interest Group. The UK Libraries Subject Headings Interest Group was founded in July 2021. It is an informal group, meaning we don't have a charge set by library leadership, and group members decide on the projects we want to focus on. As the founding convener, I planned and hosted bi-monthly meetings every other month from August 2021 through June 2022. We are currently on a summer break. Group membership covers all areas of expertise, including special collections, archives, library collections, liaisons, instruction, cataloging, and systems. In the fall of 2021, we established a group vision and agreements for discussion. We all come from different backgrounds, experiences, and understandings of problematic language and subject headings. So to create an environment that facilitates learning and sharing, We identified some group agreements to guide our discussions. These are available to group members through a closed Teams site. It's a Microsoft Teams site. In the fall semester, several colleagues did short presentations of projects they were working on. We used Zoom breakout rooms for small group discussions to identify problematic Library of Congress subject headings that we could address locally. We used the problem LCSH list on the Cataloging Lab website as a starting point. I'll talk about the Cataloging Lab later. This past spring semester, we identified 2 local heading projects for us to work on. I want to give a shout out to my colleagues Adrian Williams and Jennifer Richmond, who proposed a local heading project for catalog records with LCSH problem children. My colleague Rainid Jones and I proposed a local heading project for catalog records with LCSH racially mixed people. So a little bit about our process. We're primarily focusing on display decisions for problematic Library of Congress subject headings. Once group members identify a problematic heading they'd like to work on, they present a proposal to the rest of the group for feedback. Then we have a group discussion to address questions and concerns about the project. Once everyone agrees that we are ready to move forward with the heading change, we submit the proposal to our Director of Cataloging and Metadata Services for approval. With her approval, the proposal goes to our Discovery Systems Coordinator for implementation in Primo. Once implementation is done, heading changes will be announced through library-wide communication channels. We haven't completed the cycle for our 2 projects yet since we're on break, but we're hoping to wrap up both projects in the fall 2022 semester. As far as workflows go, our primary decision-making workflow is to either hide the problematic subject heading and display a local heading in Primo, or retain the Library of Congress subject heading if it's not too offensive, but also display a heading with inclusive language, either a local heading or a variant term from the authority record. I apologize for the cataloger speak here. So for the Problem Children project, the group recommended hiding the problematic heading in Primo and displaying only the local heading, Children with Disruptive Behaviors. For the Racially Mixed People project, we recommended retaining the heading, but also displaying multiracial people, which is a variant term included in the authority record. In both projects, we're not removing the Library of Congress subject headings from the MARC records. Those headings will continue to appear in MARC view. We are primarily prioritizing display on-off decisions so that problematic headings don't continue to display in our library catalog. I don't have any examples to share today because we haven't completed our 2 projects, but I'm happy to clarify if you have questions. As we wrapped up our first year of the subject headings interest group, I've learned many lessons as the group convener. And so I hope that the following reflections and lessons learned are helpful for you if you are thinking about a similar initiative. One of the challenges of advocating for local headings is that it can be time and labor intensive to do this work at local level, especially if you're a small institution with limited staffing. I will acknowledge that I'm privileged to be at an institution where we have the staffing expertise to share local headings related work. And I'm lucky to have colleagues who have a shared interest in continuing to address problematic language in our catalogs. Because we're approaching our work as a collective, it doesn't feel like it's one person's burden to do this work. The workload is minimized by us coming together and brainstorming ideas and solutions. There's also an immediate positive impact on our local user community by us coming together and addressing problematic headings and advocating for inclusive language in local headings. Immediate impact is always a good reason for advocating for change in libraries and library catalogs. Since our interest group is an informal group, we have the agency to set the pace for our work. My colleagues and I have the privilege of supportive leadership to take work time to come together and identify projects that support the library's guiding principle of equity, diversity, and inclusion. This makes it exciting and rewarding to take on DEIA projects supporting the information needs of our diverse users. As I shared in my previous slide, our interest group members represent almost all areas of the organization, which means we have a microcosm of the larger organization within our group for discussing potential challenges and concerns that could come up with a local heading. Because we are a diverse group with various areas of expertise, we also represent the interests and needs of diverse users. As a cataloger, I'm a strong believer that catalogers must include non-cataloging colleagues in conversations around problematic language in catalogs for efforts to be successful. Your colleagues will appreciate the space to add their feedback and input if you offer that opportunity to them. Another point of regular reflection for me is sustainability in local workflows. I think we have a profession-wide crisis of having to do more with less resources, with slashed budgets, increasing costs of library collection materials, losing institutional knowledge due to retirements, and increasing priorities and workflows. So sustainability is definitely on my mind these days. How can we create something that works over time and identify a workflow that we can continue to repeat with less tweaking? Throughout this past year, I've done a lot of reflecting on how to make our work more sustainable over time as we continue to explore projects within the interest group. By sharing these reflections and lessons learned, I hope I have inspired you to take action at whatever level you're comfortable with to make some changes in your catalogs, especially if you're also thinking about how to foster an inclusive catalog experience to your local users. So next, I want to share some resources to help you get started with projects that would help to transform your catalogs for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's impossible for me to cover every single resource and workflow for making library catalogs more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible. I have put together these resources as opportunities for self-education. I am not an expert when it comes to every single DEIA issue out there. And I've used resources in this list for my own self-education and how to be a better advocate for DEIA in libraries. So the first resource I have here is the Cataloging Lab, which is a platform created by cataloging librarian Violet Fox. It provides a myriad of resources, controlled vocabularies for specific underrepresented groups. You can propose a new subject heading or a revision to an existing subject heading. There is a clearinghouse of statements addressing bias in description. And there's also a list of problematic subject headings. And the interest group has used this list to help identify some subject headings that we wanted to work on locally. The resources list linked here is not exhaustive, but it consists mainly of readings, resources, and web events that support inclusive cataloging and inclusive description. Since accessibility is a focus of this year's conference, I want to amplify a webinar I attended recently, which is on the resources list link here. It primarily deals with mark fields for recording accessibility content in catalog records. So if that is of interest to you, I would definitely recommend checking out this resources list. This may sound like a no-brainer to this group, but identifying mark fields isn't simply going to transform our catalogs. Adding inclusive language isn't simply going to transform our catalogs. It is important to consider what fields are indexed for searching, for displaying, how you customize your discovery platform or discovery layer so that the information in mark fields are available for users to access. So the last resource I've listed here, the community source bibliography, is definitely shameless self-promotion. I recently did a research study looking into the priorities and motivations of description specialists, catalogers, metadata librarians, archivists, and museum workers, and how they engage in inclusive description work. The article was recently published, and I have a community-sourced bibliography accompanying this article. So one of the research questions I asked was if participants had any readings or resources that they found helpful to do inclusive description work. And so all of their responses have been compiled into a bibliography, which is linked here. Today, I presented a project, an initiative, and several resources for transforming the catalog for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I hope I've been successful in inspiring you and giving you some ideas to consider for prioritizing DEIA in your own library catalogs. As I'm nearing the end of my allocated time here, I want to ask you this question. Could an organization reach the point of a transformed catalog? Is that possible? In recent years, many folks in libraries and archives have come to realize that the language that was acceptable 30, 20, or even 10 years ago may not be acceptable today. Subject terms that were once considered appropriate may be considered offensive or outdated today. In the past 2 years, at least, there have been various webinars and conference presentations advocating for the language we use in our catalogs to be iterative and constantly evolving to reflect changes in language over time. So to answer my own question, I don't think it's possible for us to get to an endpoint of a transformed catalog. Projects may have an endpoint, but the work will continue as long as libraries and archives exist. Knowledge creation, organization, access, and preservation is deeply connected to language. And as language and knowledge changes over time, libraries and archives must keep up with those changes. So as my parting words, let me offer you a call to action, to think about transformational work in libraries beyond the catalog, to interrogate the spaces, the physical and intellectual spaces in which we operate as library workers. How can you extend your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility beyond the catalog? Yes, there's still plenty of work to do to make our library catalogs represent the diverse communities we serve. We still have a ways to go before our catalog records display language that is welcoming to all users. We need to continue to explore the functionality and accessibility of our catalogs and their customization to provide equitable and open access to library resources and collections. But our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility must extend beyond the catalog for efforts to create meaningful change in libraries. DEIA should be a focus in every area of your institution and organization, and not just in your catalog. DEIA in cataloging and systems work should not be approached as siloed work in institutions and organizations. It's not effective to focus on inclusive description if your workplace policies and culture is not inclusive. You can't address accessibility in metadata if your organization's website isn't accessible, or your physical spaces exclude disabled people and non-binary people. You can't achieve equity in metadata if your institution or organization continues to hire people with advanced degrees in grant-funded, temporary, and term positions, or doesn't pay its employees a livable wage. Even if efforts were well-intended, focusing on DEIA in cataloging and systems alone, while ignoring other areas of your organization or institution, is performative DEIA work. I firmly believe that you cannot truly begin to address DEIA in cataloging and systems without addressing DEIA in your overall organization. And in case you're wondering, all of this takes effort, labor, and time. There are no shortcuts here. We can't make systemic change without collective responsibility. And we cannot reach collective responsibility without an individual commitment to do better. Everyone has to commit to being responsible for their own self-education on how to dismantle bias, whether it's your internal biases or external biases that are perpetuated in library collections and catalogs. I want to encourage you to reflect and develop your own awareness of your privileged identities as you do DEIA work in cataloging systems and beyond. Everyone has a certain amount of privilege. I often hear event attendees say, I don't have the power to make this change. I hear you and understand that hierarchical structures are visual reminders of one's lack of power. But you still have access to power through your privileged identities. I want to encourage you to lean into that awareness as part of your personal commitment to do better. Thank you for listening and giving me this opportunity to share what inspires me to do better.